The Vietnam War was one of the most brutal conflicts in history, not because it had a high death toll, nor because of its duration or scale, but rather because of the harsh impact it had on the minds of the men who had to live through it every day. The psychological impact of Vietnam was greater than that of all the wars of the 20th century. It was the conflict with the highest rate of casualties due to mental illnesses. And it's no wonder, of all American wars, Vietnam was without a doubt the most hostile place for soldiers. You might think that World War I was worse, but at least there the soldiers knew where the enemies were coming from. In Vietnam, they could come from anywhere. Every step you took could be your last, and the poor equipment, as well as the hostility of the climate itself, made every second there feel like being in hell itself. And what was called fragging was the soldiers' response because they didn't want to risk their lives for a war that made no sense to them. But what was this despicable practice of fragging? In 1968, an extremely terrible and despicable phenomenon began to emerge among the US forces in Vietnam. Mysteriously, dozens and dozens of officers and non-commissioned officers began to die suddenly in accidents, all related to the handling of explosives, most commonly with grenades, either in combat or directly in combat.
Tiendas de descanso. Rápidamente se empezó a estudiar el caso y en el 99% del tiempo estos parecían ser un caso de asesinato premeditado. La situación empezó a ser tan común que los investigadores
They coined the term fragging to refer to these kinds of acts. This phrase came from the name of the M26 fragmentation grenades, which had frag clearly marked in the center, short for fragmentation. Those grenades accounted for the majority of fragging cases in Vietnam. Between 1968 and 1972, more than 904 cases of fragging were known, with 99
directos y cientos de heridos. El número de caídos, según la mayoría.
Historians believe the number is much higher, since only the most obvious cases were recorded as fragging. It was difficult to differentiate a case of fragging from an accident requiring an investigation, something that in a war was simply very hard to do. These cases went unpunished and weren't even classified as such. But why did the soldiers do that to their superiors? And how did the men manage to carry out such acts most of the time without being discovered? Well, interestingly, the answer is far from Vietnam. Fragmentation. As for mentality, American officers and non-commissioned officers were completely different from the regular troops. Both groups had grown up hearing about the glories of the men who fought in World War II. American society promoted the idea that the greatest glory for a man was to be a soldier. Having a Medal of Honor was the greatest honor a man could aspire to, but many officers came from the upper and middle classes of American society. The Vietnam War was the opportunity to make a name for oneself in history and win a glorious medal. All of this made them highly motivated and made them support the war with all their being, willing to risk their lives and those of their men. To achieve the demanding military objectives of the army, and of course my personal goals, I had to die honorably on the battlefield. That was my destiny. However, this motivation was not shared by the common soldiers. Many of these men were marginalized because of racial issues. These kinds of individuals, for the first time in history, had awakened and were seeking equality. There were also those who were there out of mere family obligation, social pressure, or simply because of economic problems. In fact, it was relatively common to see soldiers who were not mentally fit to be there. All of this, along with substance abuse and the anti-war movement in the United States, created the perfect breeding ground for disaster. The officers, who with all their being sought to meet the army's demanding military objectives, gave orders that could be considered excessive to demotivated soldiers who did not want to continue in a conflict that made no sense to them. Many of these officers also forced their men to give up illicit substances, which were relatively common in Vietnam, and even gave reckless orders. All of this caused enormous discontent among the regular troops, which often resulted in the terrible fragging. The procedure for this was simple. At first, they would just leave a grenade with its pin on the officer's pillow, or sometimes they would throw a smoke grenade into the officer's tent. In this way, he was warned and made aware that he should stop his actions. If the superior didn't request a transfer or continued with his behavior, fragging would proceed in the middle of combat. In a moment of carelessness, an active grenade would be thrown directly at him. During the night, a grenade would be placed in his tent or latrine and simply kaboom. Since it was a grenade, there was no trace left behind, nor any ammunition that could be tracked. No soldier would betray another, since either they were all accomplices or they all hated the officer. In this way, more than 90 officers fell in Vietnam and hundreds were wounded. Only about 10 perpetrators were convicted. After this practice became popular, the superiors did not discipline their men at all and did not dare to carry out excessive patrols because they feared being attacked by their own men. This practice was not only seen in Vietnam, but it also spread to all the wars of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. It's impressive how the defeat on the battlefield in Vietnam was not entirely due to the enemy's advance, but rather primarily because of the lack of support in the United States and ultimately because of the discontent of the troops themselves on the battlefield. If you like this video, you might be interested in learning about Soviet booby-trapped magazines. Thank you for watching this video, and goodbye.